Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Felipe Luzon wash processed Ecuador from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And this makes back-to-back Felipe Luzon reviews. As in the last video, we reviewed the Felipe Luzon from Regalia Coffee Roasters. And I don't think it comes as a big surprise to anybody that we also picked up Say's version of this coffee, as it gives us the opportunity to compare and contrast the two. But I do find it interesting that Say continues to release these Mejorado Típica Mejorada coffees, as I believe it shows they're every bit as excited about this variety as I am. So as long as they continue to release them, I'm going to want to continue to review them. So I'm looking forward to discussing yet another one, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Say's recipe actually, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 100 degrees Celsius, about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind, but the recipe also calls for a more fine grind than that, so a little bit more fine than your standard typical medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this one, Say is notorious for being a very light coffee roaster, and this one's in line with that as well, as this one was one of the lighter coffees I've had from them in a little bit as well. So I think a lot of people would consider this to be a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and the most distinct factor right at the start was the brightness, as it did skew a little bit in the stone fruit direction, maybe a little bit of an undefined stone fruit component to it, as there was a slight peachiness and an unripened sense. Otherwise, it was a bit tame, as it had a slight bit of sweetness, but nothing too distinct. This one definitely felt like it was going to need a bit more rest. Day 17, ran it through the Chemex, and it was a little bit more of a complex cup, as there was a slight nuttiness on the forefront, immediately followed by this unripened jammy stone fruit brightness. In addition to that, there was a little bit more of the trademark Mejorado brown candy and even herbal aspect to the cup. So this one was an interesting day, just felt a little bit more depth on this one. It did feel a little bit more in line with my previous expectations with this variety. So we continue on to day 20 as we ran it through the April dripper for the first time, and it was pretty interesting on this day as well, as there was this heightened sweetness to the cup. So up to this point, it felt like it was mostly potential in terms of that sweetness, but here I was feeling a lot more of it, as there was a brighter stone fruit sweetness coming from it, in addition to a very delicate milk chocolate base. But in addition to that, a slightly unripened strawberry, and that's one thing that was always interesting to me about picking up this coffee was the notes that they had listed on here. I believe there was a stone fruit as well as a strawberry component. And that's something I hadn't necessarily experienced from any of the Mejorado coffees up to this point. Maybe a slight bit of a citric aspect, but they're not necessarily the most fruity coffees. And even in this sense, they felt a little bit more of this kind of unripened fruit as opposed to a very strong, defined, and sweet fruit aspect. Even then, it was interesting, a little bit more of this red aspect to the cup, maybe a little bit more in terms of this herbal sense, but interesting nonetheless. Day 23, adjusted to Say's recipe, and this is when the beauty of this coffee absolutely skyrocketed, as it was by far the best day of the cup I had experienced up to this point, as there was a very high level of sweetness, most distinctly in that Mejorado brown candy-like sweet aspect. Listed peach made a lot more sense, as there was a long-lasting bit of brightness, a fruit brightness, so in general it really skewed on those two factors. As a result, it left a very excellent impression of this coffee. Day 26, adjusted to Say's recipe with the Chemex, and it was still stunning but not quite as impressive, and it was on this day I settled on the V60 being my preferred brew method, as it was still high on the brown candy sweetness, but a bit more of the floral herbality and an unripened strawberry as well. So there are the red components to it yet again. That's typically what I experience from this variety. This is a lot more in line with my expectations for it going into it. High in terms of the brightness with a little bit more of this underlying sweetness, so I wasn't able to pull out as much of the potential sweetness present within it through the Chemex, and no time was I able to, and that's why it wasn't necessarily my preferred brew method for this one. Day 28, definitely decided on the V60, as the Chemex also had this kind of nutty and herbal aspect at the forefront, with the cool down being a little bit more of this intermediary candied sweetness. With the V60, I was feeling a lot more of that hidden sweetness was unlocked, as I just kind of experienced a little bit more of that in addition to some of the fruit brightness I was present within it. At the same time, this coffee wasn't quite as easy as the Regalia one, as that one was a lot more consistent. I had a lot more impressive days with that coffee, but the best of this one I feel like may have been slightly better than the best of that one. Day 31, the cup continues to have a lot of sweetness, particularly through the V60, as it has that trademark Mejorado brown candied sweetness yet again. There's still a bit of this chocolate aspect to it, a very kind of pretty delicate milk chocolate, which is also something I picked up from Regalia's version of this coffee. Even a slight bit of nuttiness, but it does offer a very interesting fruit brightness to it as well. Day 34, final notes we have. Nothing that's really changed too much. There's still a lot of the brown candied sweetness at the forefront. Nothing has really changed too much on this day 37 mark, as towards the end, by the time I kind of figured to continue persisting with both a brew method as well as Say's recipe, I was getting a lot better coffees on a more consistent basis. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a bunch of level 4s, so we will start with the cleanliness level 4. And I think one thing that's worth noting is just how the top of this tasting wheel looks the exact same as the tasting wheel we made for the Regalia version of this coffee. But cleanliness, yes, as I said in that video, I would be really surprised if it didn't reach that level 4 in terms of clarity. Nothing too much to say on that one. Sweetness, finish, level 4. This one right here I would say is maybe a little bit more of a true level 4. This one didn't have that same sort of lingering kind of florality to it. It still had a fair bit of that florality, which you also see scoring at that level 4 mark, but not to the same extent as that honey-like aspect was present within that one. This one was a little bit more in line with that kind of brown candied aspect, but right there it was a little bit more of that true level 4. Sweetness, level 4. I can't necessarily think of a Say coffee I've had that has maybe been sweeter than this one. This is also on the higher side of the level 4. It's really verging on that level 5, but I think it was just maybe the safer play to kind of put it at that level 4 mark. Even though I wanted to demonstrate just how much sweetness there was within this one, I think it was slightly, ever so slightly sweeter than the Regalia version. Nonetheless, both were very sweet coffees, so this one definitely on the higher side of that level 4. Brightness, acidity, level 4. Yes, this one actually had a little bit more brightness than the Regalia coffee too, and I think that's kind of in line with the roast profiles of both of those two coffees. So yeah, it was a little bit more in this fruit bright sense, but nothing too overly defined, so I'm actually quite happy with it there at that level 4. Definitely more so at that level 4 than the Regalia was. Florality, level 4. Yes, this one wasn't quite as well defined, so that one was this floral honey aspect to it. This one was a little bit more of a generic kind of florality to it. I don't really have a great descriptor for it because, as mentioned, it wasn't overly precise or overly defined, but the entire cup just felt a little bit more delicate in general. And it had kind of complex florality to it as well, because I could see the traditional Mejorado, that kind of herbal florality to it, which is why the savoriness, it's actually the same as the Regalia one. These tasting wheels look pretty similar in general, but that right there, level 4, I feel like that's pretty good for this coffee. Final level 4 on this tasting wheel is the caramel, that brown candy sweetness. That one's been the same. This one was a little bit more focused, as this one never really wavered. This was a lot more consistent throughout the entirety of drinking this coffee, even though it was present in both of them. This one was never dominated by any other aspects within this coffee, at least for me, because whatever additional components were in it, they all kind of reached that level 3 mark, with the exception of the florality. Because as we're looking at the fruit components with this one, we have the berry fruit at the level 3. I could pick up an unripened strawberry, and for me it could have entirely been the priming effect because it's one of the notes that they have listed on here. Citrus fruit, once again, it's that kind of slight artificial citric components to it, which I actually really like in these coffees. So I'm fine with that being there at that level 3 mark. It also kind of contributed to the brightness. But that stone fruit is the most interesting one to me, because I would say that it felt a little bit more jammy at time, and it felt a little bit more bright. And I think the best way I can kind of lump that is typically I associate that with something like an apricot. And given that it just kind of had that brightness to it, the fruit brightness, that's where the acidity comes into play. It's there, but it's not particularly overly well defined. Chocolate, level 3. As mentioned, it's a very pretty chocolate. It's this kind of like high-end craft milk chocolate bar, as I usually like to describe when it comes to these more lighter profiled coffees in general. So I like that there at the level 3. That's the same as the Regalia coffee as well. Body level 3, I think the big change between the two is that this one was made with the V60, so this one was always going to have a little bit more body to it. But even then, you're still seeing a lot of the same things: savory, bitter, smoky, level 1. So I think if we kind of put these two together, the tasting wheels are extremely similar, with the exception maybe being the fruit components within it, as these were maybe a little bit more balanced, where that one skewed a little bit more on the kind of candied citrus direction. But yeah, I actually really like the way that this tasting wheel looks as well. I think that this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think it's really tricky to kind of pick between the two, which one I actually liked more, because at its best, I feel like this one was better, but I feel like I was able to get a much more consistent cup of coffee with the Regalia one. It was also a little easier to work with in general, but I think that's kind of the expectation a lot of people have for these coffee roasters in general, is that say can be a little tricky from time to time. Though at its very best, I was actually really impressed by this one, but that's not surprising. I've been really impressed with this variety in general, and I want to continue to review it. This had all of the things that I've been looking for in it. Very high level of sweetness, great clarity, and a lot of that brown candied component to it. Yet again, it also has that additional florality. And while these coffees, yet again, aren't overly strong in terms of the fruit direction, and it wasn't necessarily a big deal to me, because even though I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the fruit components I was getting from it, it was much more of a secondary thing relative to the big components within this one, most distinctly that brown candied component. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, yet again, I'm continuing to point people that like their sweetness towards these coffees, as they are so sweet. And that's the feedback I've been getting from so many others, is that they're enjoying these coffees for that very same reason. They're very sweet. And if they continue to have these very strong kind of distinct brown candy components to them in a much more clean sense, then it's not going to be a surprise that these coffees continue to sell really well, as I know a lot of places that brought these coffees in have been selling them really quickly. And in addition to that, it appears to say selling these coffees pretty quick as well. So I do hope that they continue to bring them in, and I don't think we're necessarily done comparing and contrasting these two coffees side by side, and that's a little bit of a foreshadowing effect right there, but I think we will leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Felipe Luzon wash processed Ecuador from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.